Okay, well, welcome everybody to our event. Thank you for being here this afternoon. First, we'd like to acknowledge, well, my name is Sam Hirsch with Horizon Ottawa. And first, we'd like to acknowledge that many of us are watching and participating today are situated on unceded and unsurrendered Indigenous land. I myself am situated on the unceded and unsurrendered land of the Algonquin people. Decades of municipal governments in Ottawa have made it clear that the Algonquin people are not welcome at the table when it comes to discussions around land use planning about their land. As we strive to build a city that genuinely works for everyone, one of our core principles is to work to decolonize our city. If we wish to build a fair and just city for all, we must work in support of and in conjunction with Indigenous communities. It is only through taking leadership from them that we will be able to decolonize our city and work towards a true reconciliation. And before we begin in earnest with the event, we have a couple of folks today who weren't able to attend because they organized a vigil in commemoration of the folks of the Asian community who died in the US. So I just want to take a very brief moment of silence for those folks right now. Okay, thank you, folks. So to continue, donc nous sommes vraiment heureux de vous tous avoir ici aujourd'hui avec nous pour cette discussion importante et pertinente. Notre ville est à la croisée des chemins. Les résidents et résidentes nous en disent qu'ils sont fatigués d'un gouvernement municipal qui s'en fout des gens les plus vulnérables dans notre ville. Qu'ils sont fatigués d'une ville qui dépense plus d'argent sur les policiers et en élargissant nos autoroutes que sur le bien-être des gens qui en ont besoin. We're here today to talk about how to win the city, but to also win back our city from the wealthy and well-connected, like the property developers who have run roughshod over our city, making it incredibly unaffordable, pushing folks to the outer limits of our large, sprawling city just so they can afford to live. Our city is one, like many across Ontario, Canada, and the world, that has been ruled too long by people like Jim Watson, who believe that the status quo is what will benefit residents only because it benefits them. Residents are fed up, and we are meeting today because we want to make sure that those who live here and those who choose to live here in the future will be able to not only live, but also able to thrive in the city of Ottawa. We will hear today from activists from around the world, including two in Barcelona, where they have had their own municipal political revolution when they elected Ada Colau, a former housing activist, as mayor of their city in 2015, something we hope to achieve here in Ottawa as well. Thank you for being with us today. So before we begin, I want to also introduce our moderator for the event, Debbie Owusu-Akyeeah. Currently, she is the executive director of the Canadian Centre for Gender and Sexual Diversity, begun in July. Debbie is a passionate Black feminist and anti-racist and social justice advocate. She has participated in and led community organizing through the Ottawa Dyke March and Harmony House Women's Shelter. She is also the recipient of a Femi Award for her feminist and youth leadership in the Ottawa-Gatineau region in 2017. She has worked at both Global Affairs Canada and Oxfam Canada. Thank you, Debbie, for agreeing to moderate this important discussion today, and I will now hand it off to you to present the rest of our panelists.
Thank you so much, Sam, for the introduction, and thank you, Horizon Ottawa, for giving me the honor to host this event today. It's really exciting to be in this kind of space with all of you here for a variety of reasons, which I'll explain later. But I think it's also awesome to be here and moderating this conversation with such an amazing panel of awesome guests who I will introduce shortly. But to tell you a little bit about myself, of course, I think Sam has introduced me well enough, but I'm someone who's called Ottawa home for the last 10 years. And in it, I've kind of seen the city remain very comfortable with being comfortable. And I'm sure many of you here can probably resonate with that comment there. I, for one, am someone who believes that power likes comfort. Power doesn't like being disrupted. Power doesn't like being bothered. And that needs to change. And I think we've been seeing those wins happen. And I think this conversation is great for us to kind of talk about what does claiming our city back really mean. But definitely, I'm someone who believes that continuing to push the envelope will give us the cities that we want to see. And this is only the beginning. And so today's event, How to Win the City, I think is an awesome opportunity for us, not only here in Ottawa, and I'm sure there are other people from different cities around the country who are here today. I think it's gonna be awesome for us to learn best practices, and that's a phrase I use a lot in the nonprofit sector, but best practices and examples of organizing that we can probably like replicate here in Ottawa, because boy, do we need it. I think of the state of municipal politics here as one of like, I don't know if boring's the right word, but like, I just think of like boring khaki pants and white t-shirts. And I've seen like the meme of like people making fun of Jim Watson's outfits, but like, it's very much so that, and it doesn't have to be. I think some of the most disheartening things that we've seen so far, especially in the context of COVID, is that we've seen things like transit be sacrificed while developers and those in power still have the opportunity to sway certain policies and procedures that we're seeing here in the city. We've seen leadership, and I'd say some, not all. We definitely have some really dope, folks at City Hall who are doing great things, but unfortunately, they continue to have their voices shut down when our mayor fails to hold Ottawa Police Services accountable. And we just saw recently this Wednesday what failing to listen to activists who were calling for defunding of the police, what can happen when the police, in response to a mental health check, go into the wrong home and terrorize yet again another Black family where young people, including a minor, are subjected to interrogation by the police. Not only that, we continue to see our city again wanting to be some sort of like condo-filled hell space, and still, instead of making it a city where biking and pedestrians are something that is centered, and that's disheartening. But I think despite all of that, what can really change things, and these are lessons that I've taken from like other Black feminists, is that we can like use our dreams and radical imagination to essentially imagine the city that we want. And I think this is what this conversation is really about. It's about reimagining what we want to see and ensuring that the things that we see as priorities are something that are made a reality. And so I really think this event is exciting because I've never ever been in an event like this in my time here in Ottawa, where we have different activists from different cities around the world kind of talking about what organizing looks like at the local level and sharing ideas that can inspire even our organizing here. So I'm excited to share this experience with you all. So before I go and I introduce our guest today, I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping while we're all here. So a little bit of a run of show. I'm going to, of course, introduce our amazing panelists today. But then after a bit of a back and forth with myself with some questions that I'll be given to our panelists, we're going to go into a Q&A session where you folks, our audience, are able to kind of ask some questions to our panelists. And so we do have a moderator who's moderating the chat. You're welcome to share any questions you want during the event. I will add that we want to ensure that this space is as safe as possible. And so please, for everybody's sake, make sure that your questions or comments are as respectful as possible. I personally would like to say there'll be a zero tolerance of any comments that are racist in nature, transphobic, anything problematic. So please keep it light and friendly, please. We'll take your questions, we'll present it to the panelists, and then we will conclude the event hopefully by 3 o'clock today. If you are, like myself, on Twitter, well, I'm not tweeting right now, but if you're someone who likes to tweet, please, you're totally welcome to. Feel free to tweet during the session today, and please use the hashtag with hashtag win the city. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our amazing speaker lineup. So first we have another Debbie Bookchin. Debbie Bookchin is a longtime journalist and author who has won awards for her news, feature, and investigative writing. She has reported for a variety of publications, including the New York Times, The Atlantic, the Boston Globe, the New York Review of Books, and has been a featured speaker at a variety of events, including the Left Forum in New York City and the Fearless City Summits in Barcelona and New York City. She is the co-editor of The Next Revolution, Popular Assemblies, and The Promise of Direct Democracy, essays on liberation municipalism by her late father, Murray Bookchin. and a member of the Municipalist project, which produces an online magazine, reports, and a curated database for this is a hard word for someone where English is not her first language, municipalist movements around the world at the website municipalism.org. She served for 3 years as press secretary to the US Congressman Bernie Sanders when he first assumed office in 1991. And if you haven't noticed, I'm wearing him on my earrings right now. Our next speaker is Kate Shea Baird. Kate Shea Baird was born and bred in London and is now based in Barcelona. She is a member of the executive team of Barcelona on Comu and is responsible for the areas of communication and participation. Our next speaker is David Palomera. David Palomera is an activist of Barcelona on Comu and other social movements in Barcelona. He's an economist doing a PhD on social care provision and inequalities, focusing on how public services are provided and the threats of austerity, privatization, and bureaucratization. And lastly, we have Mason Herson-Hord. Mason Herson-Hord is a transit justice organizer in Detroit, Michigan, with the bus riders union, Motor City Freedom Riders. Previously, he has conducted ethnographic fieldwork on community struggle against military occupation in the occupied West Bank and the occupied Western Sahara. He is a member of Symbiosis, Detroit Build and Fight, and the board of the Institute for Social Ecology. Okay, so obviously we have some badasses that are here and I'm really excited to kind of dig in and learn a little bit more. And so if folks are ready, I'll start with my first question. And my first question, I'm gonna start off giving it to you, Debbie. We're here to talk about the global municipal movement, which each of you on this panel have been instrumental in building. In fact, some of you quite literally wrote a book on it. The Principles of Global Municipalism are to radicalize democracy, feminize politics, and provide alternatives to the far right. Can you tell us more about what this means and what it looks like more practically in your work?
Yes, thank you so much. And first of all, I just want to say thank you to everybody who put this event together. Debbie, thanks so much for moderating, and Sam for all the prep work, and everybody at Horizon Ottawa. It's really a pleasure to be here with all my wonderful fellow friends, panelists, and also everybody who's taking their Sunday afternoon part of it to tune in. So greetings to everybody, and thank you again for inviting me. You know, this question, this first question, is obviously a very packed question, which is, you know, we will discuss it, I'm sure, in a certain sense throughout. But just to start with the very first part of the question about radicalizing democracy, you know, I mean, first of all, it's important to say right out the gate that municipalism really takes on different meanings and has different approaches in different environments. And, you know, especially given the sort of varying parameters that different nation states impose on regions and municipalities, I think that it's very important to say that obviously what works in one place might not work in another. So there's certainly no prescription, you know, that is a one size fits all. But with that in mind, I think, you know, there are certain features about radical municipalism that are very important. And that one of the most important and significant ones is the idea that we really have to reinvest power with people at the local level. And so on a very fundamental level, radical municipalism means to work to try and create a kind of government where instead of going to vote for someone who represents you, in a certain sense, you basically think of it as representing yourself. And that really means creating forums where people can give voice to their desires about their communities. So for me, what makes, you know, municipalism radical, and more than just, say, electing a more progressive candidate to the office, is that it must focus on assembly democracy. And I know that right now that's a difficult thing to think about because we've been in the middle of a pandemic and everybody's been very isolated, but hopefully as things pass and things improve, we will be able to get together again more physically in the same spaces. And not that there isn't a place for, you know, having sort of referenda by doing online. There's all kinds of important aspects of technology. But the reason that I really highlight and emphasize this idea of assembly democracy is that I think that it allows us to, in a certain sense, really transform the very idea of what politics is. And right now, you know, we grow up in a world where we're taught that politics is basically going into a ballot box, a ballot voting booth, and voting on the ballot for the person who is kind of the lesser of the evils. The person who hopefully is giving voice to maybe some of the things, you know, that people in the community might want in a little bit better fashion than the other person who's more maybe controlled by developers. But I think that really we have to start thinking about the idea that the only way we're going to survive the environmental crisis and the only way that we're going to transform our local economies is by each individual member of a community having a say in what the community needs, because of course those are the people who are best suited to do so, and to think of it as a kind of a new, like, politics, instead of this faraway thing that's just done by other people, as something that becomes part of everyday life. And so that means that we really change ourselves in the process of it. It's very much a communal activity, a place where people come together, where they meet, where they get to know each other, where they get to know their neighbors, and can really think through what policies are important, and can talk and can get to know and can get to really, in a sense, experience the kind of communal engagement that neoliberalism deprives us of, you know, day in and day out. And the other aspect that I want to emphasize that I think is important about that process is education, because education is very critical to building a municipalist politics. I really believe that, you know, this kind of politics doesn't happen overnight. It's something that takes time, that takes months, it takes years of people getting to know each other. And that in this process of sort of meeting together and talking, we allow ourselves to sort of become familiar with the history of our communities, with the different issues that are facing not only the community, but the people in our neighborhoods, on our blocks. And that sort of encourages a kind of mutual aid and a sense of cooperation, which I think is so critical and is a fundamental part of a municipalist, a radical municipalist politics. And then another part of your question had to do with the feminization of politics. And I think, you know, that it's important, of course, to make sure that the municipalist politics that we embrace is prefigurative, in the sense that we are trying to begin to live the values that we would like to see society embrace. And so that really means, again, values of mutual aid, of cooperation, of horizontalism. It also means, of course, very specific things like putting more women into positions of power. It means really paying attention to not only women, but all marginalized groups, and making sure that we not only you know, give equal time, for example, to speakers in a meeting, but that we bend over backwards to make sure that people who might not ordinarily think of themselves in leadership roles are encouraged to play those roles. And I don't want to talk for too long, so I will turn it over to the next speaker, but I'm sure we'll come back to this and be able to discuss it some more.
Thank you so much, Debbie. David, I wanted to see if you wanted to add anything to that question.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for hosting this, for organizing all this. Thank you, Origin Ottawa, for the invitation. And thank you, Debbie, for moderating all this. Debbie has already said things that I don't want to overlap with, but let me just try to put some ingredients in what in what she just said. So it's obvious that municipalists seek the active participation of neighbors and therefore must give the communities the instruments to take the decisions collectively. So this is why local governments have to enable and support local structures and allow for self-organization. No? And this can be very challenging. So for example, if we imagine the care sector, no? Where we find a lot of people very vulnerable to exploitation and which doesn't participate much in the public sphere. And so in Barcelona, I think we are making small steps towards giving the tools and room for self-organization to, for example, municipal care workers. We divide the city in very different small areas called social super blocks, where care workers work as a team. So we seek, instead of care workers working alone, we seek them to work as a team and to self-organize their work. No? And we also understand that this, how we divide the city, we must divide it in a way that the community participates in how care is provided and participates in care. So we need to implicate the community in order to care, not to fall as a burden, as always, to low-income women curtailing their rights to their own care, for example. No? So this is an example. No? So how to think in a way that we seek the participation of care workers, for example. No? So, and also radical democracy means to democratize our economies. So this is why in Barcelona, there is an important commitment to promote, strengthen, and learn from the cooperativist movement. We need powerful and resilient cooperativist networks that democratize our relationships as producers and as consumers. And then to the feminization of politics, I think also some ingredients. It's not ideal that as a man talks about this, but let me just point to some things. And so as Debbie said, we need first, a minimum condition is that we need gender parity in all spheres. Then we need participative methodologies that work as possible. So in order to do that, we have to think that men always talk a lot in assemblies and all that. So we have to put the room and tools in order to try to minimize all this overrepresentation of men. And also, I think the feminization of politics thinks and tries to see that everybody is an expert in their own neighborhoods. So we don't have to rely on experts on the municipal platform, municipal governments. Everybody is an expert in their own area. And finally, we have to organize assemblies in a way that women can participate because they are always the ones that have to do care reproductive activities. So we have to allow them to have the space. We cannot in different ways. And finally, this is the most complicated, is to include gender equality and gender perspective in all policy arenas. So cities have been designed by men, normally with a masculine vision. So we must change that. And we must think critically how we organize things. So for example, we can create budgets and design the urban landscape to allow secure and higher woman participation in the public sphere. No? For example, later we're gonna talk about transit. Promoting transit is important because normally it's women that uses more this type of mobility tools than men. So for example, increasing transit is important. And so yeah, I will leave it here and go.
No, thank you so much, David. I really appreciate it. And what really stood out to me in both of your responses, and I took my own notes about it, is definitely the reinvestment of power with people at the local level. And Debbie, you mentioned something there about like neoliberalism. Essentially, it doesn't want us to be engaged. It thrives in us not being engaged. And there's something about like building community that is, I think, integral into reinvesting power with people so that they're not only engaged in politics when it comes to election time. And I think there's many activists that I'm seeing here in the chat today who are part of those people who are building community. And this is the work that I think is integral in us kind of building the communities we want. And to tie it very much to what David mentioned, like using Barcelona as an example, but then also talking about what it looks like to carve out that space so that women and other marginalized people are part of that decision-making power. Absolutely. And I think that's why it's also beautiful that feminist activists in this city are part of the work that is happening to build community and to hold politics accountable at the municipal level. So I really appreciate both of your insight. It's beautiful. And I think it ties really well to the next question, which I'm going to let Kate answer. Kate is open to it. In campaigns like Barcelona on Comu, the democratization of political organizing structures seem to be key to the movement. Can you tell us more about that, and how can we make a citywide movement that is run by activists, neighbors, and community members as opposed to like high-level political staff? I'd love to know what your thoughts are on that. And what are some of the challenges, limits, and opportunities of participatory procedures to develop real democracy at the local level? And if at any point you need me to clarify anything or like break down that question, I'm glad to do so. So Kate, please share your thoughts.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for this event. And I really want to say that it's so important for us to come to events like this, because in 2015, a group of us who had never had any previous experience in institutional politics somehow managed to win the mayoralty of the second biggest city in Spain. And we were seen as intruders then by all of the powers that be, who, like Debbie said, like being comfortable and like things staying as they are. And they haven't stopped treating us as intruders every day since. The opposition parties, the media, the economic powers. And so in the battle of, the day-to-day against these huge powers, which can be really tough, to see that there are other organizations in other cities that are looking at what we've done and who are inspired by it and who want to do something different is really, really something that helps to keep us going and helps to keep us, in the fight and ready for another day. To know that we're not alone in this project, which seems to be growing around the world. So it really is a pleasure to be here. So the question was how to avoid, how to democratize political organize, and particularly how to avoid all the decisions being taken by high-level political staff or electeds or all of that. And as Debbie said, the goal of municipalism is to decentralize power and have the main power of decision-making in popular assemblies. But as Debbie also said, in the real world, often you do have people who are employed by your party or who are in the institutions who do have more power. And so the first thing I wanted to say that's a really important tool for us, given that we aren't, it's not practically possible for us to take every decision in an open popular assembly, given that we're working within the existing institutions, is that we have a code of ethics. So the first thing is that we have term limits, for example, for our electeds, because we don't want them to become professionalized politicians who are there for decades and decades. We have a salary limit as well for similar reasons, that we don't want our electeds to be, I don't know what it's like in Canada, but in Spain, elected politicians have salaries that are way beyond what ordinary people earn. And we in Barcelona and Comu also have certain decisions that have to be taken in assembly. So, okay, we say our electeds in the day-to-day can make decisions without consulting our assembly, but there are certain decisions like, for example, entering into a coalition government or approving our election manifesto or other big things that they don't have the power to do. So that's the first thing, is putting some controls on the people who inevitably will have more power. The other thing that's really important for us are our local neighborhood assemblies. We have about 20 of them around the city. And these are groups of activists who are often participate actively in social movements as well. And that really allows us to have mini assemblies around the city that can really respond to those local needs and local concerns. Another thing is that obviously our manifesto and our political program were basically written by citizens. We had an open process where people could put forward ideas either at city level or neighborhood level. So when our electeds are there putting forward our program, the program has already been developed democratically. I'm conscious of time, so I'll try to rush through some other things. Another thing that's important is we have this idea of overflow, we call it. So one thing is that we have participatory processes, right? That we, in our organizing, where we say, okay, we're going to draw up our manifesto and we're going to take in suggestions and put it together, or we're going to have a debate about, you know, X topic, and we're going to get everyone involved and have a big assembly and blah, blah, blah. But we also have this idea of overflow, which is that it's like anyone can put forward a debate or an idea or a project. And so our local assemblies, for example, are quite autonomous. And so it's not about necessarily having like huge macro decision-making processes, but also like allowing that spontaneity and allowing people to just lead from below with different initiatives is really important for us. And the other thing is having diverse ways of participating. So some people want to have like a long assembly debate about, I don't know, mobility policy and sit there for hours talking about it, and that's great. Some people don't want to do that, and they prefer to be knocking doors, or they'd prefer to be singing. We have a choir, or they prefer their role to be more in like, we have a conflict resolution and care group that helps in that way, or even we have an international committee. So your activism could be explaining what we do abroad, right? So like have like the broadest range of ways of participating, which helps to bring in more diverse people. In terms of limits and challenges, there are so many. It's not easy, but I would say there are two main elements. One's already been mentioned, which is how existing hierarchies reproduce in the democratic spaces that you create. And that happens along lines of gender, along lines of race, along lines of class. And obviously there's two challenges there. One is getting people through the door, you know, right? So, and then there's the challenge of when they're there, having them have an equal voice and weight in the debates and in the activities. So we have different mechanisms to try and do that. We have time limits on people speaking. We try to use different methodologies. So not everything involves, you know, standing up in front of hundreds of people and speaking. You might be able to participate by post-it notes or by writing something down or in small groups, or well, we try and use different methodologies that different people can feel comfortable with. And then the other big one is the pace of political life when you're governing a big city. And like I said before, not every decision can be taken to an assembly to be debated. And so there's always that tension between when anything slightly diverts from what's in our manifesto, you know, and because political life is unpredictable and so sometimes the government will do something and our assemblies and our activists will be like, what? And and usually when that happens, actually, you know, our counsellors always come and say, well, the thing is that this happened and then that happened. We had to choose between this and that. And once they talk it through, usually our activists are like, oh yeah, like we would have done the same thing. Sometimes they're like, no, we wouldn't. And then, you know, there's a tension there. But yeah, that's a constant tension when, and I think being in government definitely makes it more difficult. I'll leave it there so I don't ramble on and on, but yeah.
No, thank you, Kate. I really appreciate your answer there, because I think you shared some very beautiful things where we're seeing some examples here in Ottawa of people kind of taking things back to their communities and talking about it and amongst themselves and trying to somehow bring it back to City Hall, which is the place where most of these conversations take place with our municipal councillors and our mayor. But you said something early that really resonated with me, and I think it would resonate with a lot of folks who have been part of the campaigns for many of the folks and the activists that we are trying to like put or trying to push to be in positions of power at the municipal level. You know, being seen as an intruder, I think definitely resonates. And we've seen that discourse, not only in the municipal level, but even with community associations where folks who might be on the rad side are kind of seen as like these like radical, like Antifa who are coming to take over, and how even those who are elected are treated and pushed out in certain decision-making spaces. And so definitely pushing and challenging that is something that I think is central to our organizing, but definitely bringing it back to the different parts of our community where folks who are focused on transit are talking about the ways we can do it and making sure that messaging goes to our allies who are in there debating these things, right? And so I really, really appreciate it. And I hope people were taking notes, because there's definitely some lessons that could be applied here in Ottawa. So the next question. In Ottawa, we face many crises from climate, housing, racial, and economic inequalities, but they are not always visible to or felt by the majority of people. And in Canada, there's also sometimes a tendency to frame ourselves as more progressive than our neighbor to the south. I hate that. Eschewing critical analysis of our own issues. This can especially be true when certain urban issues are understood to be a concern of only a particular populations in a city. For example, you know, we're currently seeing transit in Ottawa being framed as a service that isn't important to suburban residents, where if you actually understand how the city is shaped and just where people are working, it is an extremely important issue. So my first person that I'm hoping could answer this, Mason, and then Debbie, if there's time, I'd love to hear from you. What are some possible avenues to make our crises more visible to the mainstream? And how do we mobilize and create healthy democracy with people whose interests may seem at odds with our aims?
Those are great, really tough questions. I think I'll start by just giving a little bit of background on my own work with transit, because in Detroit, we encounter a lot of the same problems. Particularly the city-suburb divide and struggles around getting suburban leadership to recognize and embrace the necessity of transit as a regional public good. So Detroit has one of the lowest funded public transit systems in the US. I'm not totally sure how that would compare to Canadian ones, but I imagine we'd be towards the bottom up there as well. And so my organization's approach to this has been that we believe that the problems of transit are issues of power, that the people who depend on public transit are some of the least powerful people in our region, overwhelmingly poor or working poor. The vast majority of riders in the system are Black, and a high proportion of riders are also on the bus because they have disabilities that prevent them from riding. And so the decisions being made at the regional level about how transit is to be funded, are not made with riders at the table or riders in mind. So this is a problem of democracy at a fundamental level. The people who are most affected by an issue not being included in the decision-making process that shapes those outcomes. And so our approach has been to organize riders as a mass constituency, attempt to build political power for riders as a way of putting transformative expansions of transit service on the political agenda. I think there are some weaknesses with this approach that we have to kind of grapple with, and I think that might help answer your question, Debbie, about how we can make our particular issues more visible to a majority that doesn't necessarily care about them, or is not directly affected by them. So for the most part, the way that the power of riders, even on a large scale, is being built and manifested is as a political constituency, a group of people that elected officials should care about because they are organized together and can potentially have some sort of impact on election outcomes and things like that. And I think that's one of the weakest forms of political power, given the ways that representative democracy almost always skew towards the interests of the wealthy and powerful. And for other movements like the housing movement and tenant struggles, they can organize along those lines as well, trying to pressure elected officials and so forth. But their real power is in disruption, in being able to withhold rent in an organized way gives them far more leverage than being able to, than calling into city council or things like that. It's the same thing with the labor movement. They have this leverage over production that they can shut it down. There's no need to, call into your city council member to be another voter for them to consider. And so the problems that we're trying to grapple with as transit organizers are, what are our capacities for disruption? What is the leverage that we have within transportation, within the city, that would allow riders to force their needs and their issues onto the political agenda in the same way that other sites of struggle have, where they can disrupt the normal running of things, as Debbie was talking about at the beginning, of what those in power hate the most. And so I think that is kind of the kernel of how these different kinds of urban movements can be successful, is having a thorough grasp of what kinds of untapped power they already have to interfere with business as usual, and I think that's how our issues get forced into the public eye.
Thank you so much, Mason. Debbie B.
Thanks so much. The difficulties of engaging different segments of the population are obviously, complicated by what particular city you live in, what type of town, where people are at. So there's a couple of different things I would say about this. The first thing is that, in order to do a municipalist politics, you don't necessarily have to start out by engaging everybody. I mean, there will always be some segment of people who just won't, who don't care or won't be engaged, or will take a much longer time to come around to municipalist issues, and that's okay, So, I mean, it's specifically sort of to answer the question like about, for example, whether suburban people really feel like they have a stake in transit in Ottawa. I mean, the only thing that I can think of in terms of sort of that and other questions of getting engagement is to try to speak to people kind of where they are, and to and also to find those issues that really cut across geographical and class lines. And so, for example, everybody in Ottawa should have a stake in, say, air quality. And the more cars you have running around in suburban areas of the city, the worse it is for everybody. And I would say that that would be sort of one way to try and get engagement. And the same is true for water quality, and the same should be true for utility bills. And, there are issues, I think, that sort of cut across geographic and class, or economic lines that can be used to reach out to people and to try and broaden the message. That's the other thing that I was sort of emphasizing before, which is that the process of education does take time, and we can start ourselves in smaller groups. There's ways to do reading groups, study groups, take on issues and write reports. You guys have done a wonderful report already, about development and the whole way that developers basically own pretty much the city council, with the exception of a few of your members. That's been really an extraordinary, a beautiful report, and something that should be sort of publicized in many different ways. You have an executive summary, but maybe that kind of thing can also at some point be made into a leaflet with bullet points and that sort of thing. So, I think that, yes, there's always going to be a tension there between participation and also and not participation, but also a tension between sort of what we can do on the electoral level and what we do within social organizations, within our movement, our grassroots organizations. And all of that's okay. And all of that, it depends, and is diverse. Like, for example, I have made a point just before of emphasizing the fact that I think that a real municipalist politics must entail a complete change in the way people think about politics as a long-term project. But, and preferably, I would say it's important to start, by really working, like one of the things that Mason's group does is, they go door to door in Detroit, and they're really trying to organize people on the block level. But for example, in Ottawa, you may find yourselves needing to run candidates even before you feel like you've done a neighborhood assembly thing, because you have such a dire situation, with some of the people on the city council. And that's okay too. I would just say that any candidate that you put forward you should try and at least have situations, bylaws, ethics, a code of ethics, those sorts of things in place, so that as you engage the community more and more, those people see themselves very much as delegates, not individual elected representatives who can do whatever they want, but delegates of the neighborhood assemblies. So it can work on different levels and at different times, do different things. But I think, the fact that you're starting where you are is right.
Thank you both. I think you both have shared some very awesome things there. Mason, for example, what you were sharing with the work that you're doing with the transit riders, and like I made a note of this because I thought it was really awesome. Like, there is real power in disruption. Like, when it comes to our engagement in this project that is like municipal politics, we don't have to just wait for voting. It doesn't have to wait for you to, sometimes you're forced not to even be at the table. And in Ottawa's context, our own mayor will silence you by blocking you on Twitter if you try to engage him on certain things, right? And so there is real power in disruption. And I think in the context of COVID, we saw this when people were organizing around the rent strike, and how beautiful that organizing looked like, because it looked like everyone was part of it. And it was definitely ties on what you mentioned, Debbie, like it went across class lines. And for Ottawa, who has very unique pockets of the population, I think it met people where they're at, because we were all scared at the beginning of COVID. And so people were concerned about their housing. And that became a place where a lot of people were like, okay, what do we do, right? And so it was a beautiful example of like real power and disruption. And I think another thing that you mentioned, Debbie, about meeting people where they're at, I think we've also seen other examples here in the city of like legit meeting people where they are at. I think CPEP, who's been doing work on abolition, they had an assembly recently where they had posters in different languages. So making sure that the stuff that you're organizing on has Somali, because we know that there is a significant Somali population. Arabic, making sure that there's certain indigenous languages considering the population that is here too, right? And so these are lessons that I think are super important for us to not only meet people where they're at, but then to also show that they have power themselves. And it just requires finding where they're at and letting them know that their engagement can look like so many different things. So thank you so much for your answers to that question. So we're talking about mobilizing new folks in our movement. And I kind of touched on that a little bit with meeting people where they're at. You know, we are raising awareness and providing analysis, then we're turning that analysis into action. And we're also talking about mobilizing for alternatives to the institutions that currently exist. So this question is for everyone, but definitely at some point, Kate, we'd love to hear your thoughts on this one in particular. What do you say to people who say it is impossible? And how do we inspire people to imagine something radical? Would anyone like to go first?
I don't mind starting.
Perfect.
No, for me, actually, this question talks to the greatest power of municipalism in comparison to other left strategies, because I think that's something we have to think about when we talk about why municipalism. It's also why municipalism compared to the other things that are out there, or the other things that we've tried. And actually, it's the fact that because it's defined by the local scale and people coming together and working on very tangible issues on their front door, literally sometimes, it's actually where people can see change happen for themselves. And we have this idea of small victories, which prove that change is possible, which comes from the PA housing movement that Ada led before becoming mayor, because which was incredibly powerful what happened in the PA, because there were hundreds of evictions every day in Spain. And what did the PA do? The PA started to stop them. I mean, they brought people together to stand in front of the front doors of people who are going to be evicted. They formed a human barrier. And the first eviction that was stopped, everyone there felt like, wow, si se puede, you know? And everyone there went out and told their friends, their families, today we stopped an eviction. And the next time they went to stop eviction, there were more people there. And the next time there were more people there, because it wasn't some crazy idea, right? They actually showed, you know, okay, it was only one eviction when there's hundreds every day, but they actually did it. So we've taken that idea into our movement, and the idea is, okay, maybe we want to overthrow global capitalism and install a new economic system and you know, popular assemblies. And okay, maybe we haven't done that yet, but we have created a municipal energy company in Barcelona. We have stopped hundreds and hundreds of evictions. We have created a new participation system that allows residents to propose city laws. So each of these things, however small, is something that to somebody who thinks that there's no point in participating in politics is actually not just an argument. They can see it, you know, with their own eyes. And so, yeah, si se puede, and that's what we've got to do. We've got to pick the winnable battles, and with each winnable battle that we win, we're going to bring in more people, because most people actually only want to spend their time on things that are either fun or useful. And if politics isn't fun and or useful, most people are not going to spend their time doing it. So, yeah.
100%. Politics must be fun and useful. Oh, I love that. Were there any other or panelists who wanted to tackle that question?
I can take a stab at it. I think the key to answering the question or the response of is this even possible is to start small and prove it. I think one of the ways that I approach movement organizing is to in the beginning stages set aside the ideas and keep things really focused on the concrete and the material, the kinds of activities that we can do that have immediate concrete impacts on people's lives, because that is what you need to be achieving to actually bring in working class people into your struggle. So just as a way of example, some neighbors and I started a block club on our street, which is kind of like a long-term local Detroit institution, basically hyper-local organizations of neighbors that have been around since at least the 40s. We were approaching this with, we're trying to build assembly democracy in our neighborhood. We want to be helping to create the building blocks of a federation of neighborhood democracy that the powers of the city government can be dissolved into, that can take over vacant land and manage it communally. But this is not the pitch that you give when you go to someone door to door. You need to identify the problems that we as an organizing vehicle, as a container for collective action, can actually respond to, that people are going to be wanting to get involved in. So the very first projects that we took up were in response to illegal dumping. So our neighborhood's really blighted. There'll be contractors from the suburbs or other parts of the city who will literally show up in the middle of the night, and sometimes in broad daylight, and dump a bunch of like construction waste on a vacant lot, and drive off. And so we organized cleanups. We put together like neighborhood watch squads to try to chase these people off. Just like very basic stuff that it was immediately obvious to everyone how it would benefit them to participate in this. Where there's a very clear A to B relationship in my activities, collective benefit, and so forth. And as we built up this organization, this structure for collective action, we could then channel that towards bigger and more significant things. So we had this really big fight with the city planning department trying to keep out an industrial development where our rec center used to be. And that became the organizing vehicle for the whole neighborhood in resisting this, and brought a whole bunch of people into the broader struggle. Now we're doing things like, we started a community garden last spring. We've been doing like mutual aid food distributions around the neighborhood for older people who can't safely go to grocery stores. We bought a house that we're like fixing up to use into a community space. And now we're also in the beginnings of forming a coalition or a federation with other block clubs in the surrounding area in the neighborhood. But the only way it worked was keeping our eyes on the immediate, the concrete, the material things that are of obvious benefit to the people that we want participating, and the real power and more deeper revolutionary potential is something you build along the way.
Thank you so much. David, Debbie, don't know if either of you would like to take a stab at that question.
I can run to the next one. So if Debbie wants to say something here, and then for the next one, I will start.
I'll just say something briefly along the line. It's very much along the lines of what Mason and Kate have said. So just very briefly, it really is. I mean, for example, my most experience has been in Burlington, Vermont, where really, the platform that was put forward by the Municipalist organization contained a lot of, important issues about social ecology, about direct democracy, strengthening planning assemblies. But the thing that really got people engaged was when the mayor wanted to put up a big development on the waterfront, and everybody came together to fight that. And the same thing when they wanted to, put in a wood chip plant. And so over and over again, I think as everybody, Kate and Mason, and I'm sure David would emphasize, it is taking these individual projects and which feel very doable to people and mobilizing people along those lines. And then, building out from that so that, for example, at a certain point, you might have a candidate who would run on a platform that is a, much more anti-development platform. And then, and using the skills of things like phone banking and door-to-door and kind of building out from those things. But as the folks at Barcelona and Comu have emphasized over and over again, it is the very specific projects that really get people engaged, that make people feel that they can have success, and that in the process of doing that, we become sort of like more communal people, and that makes the next thing seem even more feasible. And also in terms of having fun, it's great to have meals together. Neighborhood organizations should, have spaghetti dinners or pizzas, and there should be, I think it's great that in Barcelona there's a choral group. All of those things build community and build a sense of power, among the individuals and within the group.
If I cannot hear something, it is, I have to think that it's so masculine to think about this big idea. You have to do one thing and solve everything with one big idea. And we have to incorporate this feminist vision, that the quotidian, the things we do in every day is important, and not to be with the burden of one big idea of a big writer or something, but we create the solutions every day, and we learn every day. And I think incorporating this is important in our assembly as well.
Absolutely, 100%. Oh, I love it. And I think you folks have all tied on to this thing, which I think is a beautiful dichotomy that exists between picking these winnable battles, but then also building community at the same time. And I think that's what's so important, is bringing those two in. And I've been seeing some comments about people talking about like choir and drinks. And it's like, it naturally happens where when you come together for these small things, and I've seen it, I saw it with the Herringate evictions. We've seen it with so many other examples in the city that they were small, relatively small, moving away from this masculinist vision of policy changes, like David mentioned, where people came together and they built a community, and these are communities that are long lasting and that find power in being together. And so absolutely, I see it not only as a political project, but definitely a community project as well. So we've been chatting here about the global municipal movement, but obviously we're talking about actions that are hyper-local. David, you can definitely go first, and then Debbie, but then also any of the other panelists. How do we connect our local actions to the global? And this is very, I love this question. And how has connecting with other folks from around the world advanced the movement?
Yeah, I think it's crucial because, Debbie was telling me that my mic sounds fuzzy. Is it okay now?
Yes, much better now.
Perfect, thank you. And thank you, Debbie, for letting me know. And so I think this is like the municipalist movement is more not a question of how, like, okay, it's important the how, but it's important to remember that we have to do it. I mean, we cannot build local solutions without tackling global issues. So it's not a matter of should we do it? We need to do it. And this is how I think I learned from the alter globalist movement, that you have to fight the corporative power and multinationals and all these interests in a way that you touch upon all the infrastructures, international infrastructures that you can in order to fight this. The problem with the alter globalist movement is that you end up talking about trade deals and stuff that looks a little bit sometimes outside of the everyday lives of people. And I think the good thing of municipalist movement is to bring back to the local but remembering that it's important to connect it to the global, no? So how to do it? I think we have to build dense networks and invest. We need funds because this is important. We need to put resources into building networks that work as alternatives to existing nation-state networks. So in the example of Barcelona, maybe a nice example is the, all the networks around cities and the initiative called Municipalize Europe as well, which was putting into the mainstream and putting into the European debate all the initiatives, all the local initiatives on how we should municipalize our policies, no? So try to touch upon how, these international networks should try to at least defend or at least protect municipalist movements, because we have to understand that states will always suppress, will always attack municipalist movements. So we need to build this defense, because the state will never allow for the municipalists to grow. So we need something bigger in order to try to confront the balance of the state. And I think that one of the most important things we can do in these networks is to learn from other experiences. So that's the reason I wanted to talk now, not before, because we're talking about small victories and all that. And I think it's important to know that we don't know anything from certain in the municipalist movement. And it's always the thing that is in construction process, and we have to learn from the victories and defeats in order to improve. So it is important that we look at history, we look at the present, and we are open to learn what are the failures and victories of the things we do. So here, people were making questions about the tensions, and Kate was talking about the tensions in the municipalist government. So it is important. Okay, we have Barcelona, we have reached the government. Maybe this thing that doesn't last, but let's learn as much as we can, so our failures are translated into victories in the future, in case there are failures, no? And the latest step is important also. The latest thing I want to mention is also that the legal and laws are very harmful for people, and we have to fight all this global legal framework that we have and transform it. So we need to build local networks in order to change all the legal frameworks that are stopping local initiatives to grow. So for example, in Barcelona, we have a problem to municipalize the care workers, the municipal care workers, because now it's externalized. So what are the difficulties? Legal problems. So we need to fight with our strengths all the legal problems that we face in order to advance in all our small projects as well.
So this is also a really, really important question, and thank you for including it. I think first of all, municipalism by its very nature is a confederal philosophy, because it really, if our goal is ultimately to disempower nation states, then the way we're going to make decisions is by ever greater sort of municipal confederal programs where people send delegates. Things have been written about this, which I'm sure many people here are familiar with, but the idea that each neighborhood sends a delegate to be, part of a council on the city level, and then they in turn send delegates to be parts of regional councils, and that and I think, frankly, people think it's naive, but I think major world issues like global warming can be solved in a municipalist politics, because that's how you start to build consensus. That's how you educate people. Then you send delegates. And so I think that by its very nature, it's a internationalist concept, municipalism, even though people tend to think of it as very local. And by the way, just on that aspect of it, I have to mention that, a really good example of how this is done is what the Kurds have been doing in the north and east of Syria, in Rojava, where their project, and they're now governing an area of about 5 million people. Obviously, it's a very multi-ethnic area. It's not just the Kurdish people, but their whole project is based on citizens' assemblies and on the idea that people delegate, send a delegate who reports back to the assembly, and the assembly discusses and then gives further instructions, and each delegate goes higher and higher until there's a kind of a regional, and then I'm not going to call it nationwide because it's not a nation state, it's within northern Syria, but it's a government structure that is completely independent of that of the rest of Syria. And it's also a very highly feminist example too, which has been incredibly important because, you know, women are co-chairs at every level of government, whether it's a administrative position or, you know, legislative positions. There are always at least 40% and often more women. So that model of Rojava, I think, is really important. And that sort of brings me to the second part of this, which is sort of how do we express our solidarity internationally? And obviously, it's incredibly important to share ideas, to not, every community shouldn't have to reinvent the wheel. There are now hundreds of communities practicing a municipalist type politics. Some of them are in power in governments, some of them are not, but all of them are doing amazing, original and creative things. And so sharing that, and, you know, for example, you know, some of them are outlined in the book Fearless Cities, which the people in Barcelona and Comu put together. And so that book is a great resource, and there are many online resources. But I think that, you know, that kind of solidarity has unfortunately, to some extent, been diminished a little bit within the left even, because of the fact that people are suffering so much under neoliberalism. People are very concerned about what's going on in their own communities. People are sort of forced since the pandemic into isolation. And I think it's something that, you know, we should rediscover, because it's obviously part of the very rich history of left politics worldwide, is internationalism, and that we really need to support. And that when things are going on, like, you know, Erdogan is in Turkey is reducing the rights of women there, that the left here in Canada, everywhere, really needs to be in solidarity with the people of Turkey, the Kurds and others who are being oppressed, and that this is the sort of the case everywhere. Obviously, you know, there's a lot of fascism on the rise, and we can't be everywhere at once. But I think that reaching out and trying to share ideas and trying to show support is incredibly important, and that ultimately that whole process also helps preventing our municipalist politics from becoming a kind of a parochialist politics, because the education, what David mentioned, you know, the educational aspect of it also is really critical, because we have to help the people in our communities understand that this sense of proprietariness, you know, that they feel because of the horrific economic conditions that so many people are subjected to, is just that. It's a product of neoliberalism, and that ultimately we are all stronger when we're in solidarity, when we're practicing mutual aid, when we're helping the other people in our communities survive and you know, bring to fruition these kinds of you know, mutualistic efforts. So I just add that thought.
Thank you. Kate, you have your hand up. Did you want to add to that?
I just wanted to add one thing, which I think is really important, even before the learning and sharing and the fighting global powers together stuff, which I completely agree with. But there's something even necessary for that to happen, which is putting a name to what we're doing and recognizing one another as being part of the same thing, which is this thing called municipalism. And the international dimension is super important for that. I remember when we won in 2015, firstly, I started to look into this municipalism thing, and I found Debbie's book, well, her edited book of her father's work, and I discovered there was this whole theoretical background. Then I discovered there were historical examples around the world. then I discovered that people in Italy had already done this in the 70s, people had done it in the UK in the 80s, people were doing it now in France. And we organized this Fearless Cities conference in 2017, where 700 people came, and we discovered that, this thing, all of these isolated examples, both historically and today, when we came together, we realized that it was an actual thing. It's an actual way of working, different in different contexts, but it allowed us to put a name to it, whether it be municipalism or fearless cities or whatever, and kind of build a shared identity and a sense of kind of collective identity and of a political project that goes beyond any one particular example. And I think that dimension is, now we take it for granted, but I think that because over the last few years, I think there's been more contact internationally and more communication about these ideas. But if it wasn't for that, I think all of these different projects would feel very isolated from one another, and maybe wouldn't even understand themselves as municipalist.
Thank you, Mason. I don't know if you wanted to add anything.
Yeah, I just wanted to briefly touch on another example of some beyond the local organizing of people doing radical democracy work. So I've been part of a network called Symbiosis, which is not a global project. It tackled the somewhat more manageable scope of North America initially, but is a federation of a number of different radical community organizations in Canada, the US, and Mexico that are working to build dual power, that's like directly democratic power outside the state in our own communities. And there are kind of like three main reasons why we wanted to come together into a more intentional network or federation. The first was just a simple matter of want to have more, facilitate more intentional ways of learning from one another's experience, of sharing our collective knowledge and education within the movement, to avoid having to reinvent all of these wheels. Secondly, to have a sort of a shared common platform that we could use to help seed new such movements in other places where they don't already exist. And then lastly, a bit more aspirationally, to build the building blocks of decision-making beyond the local level so that we can coordinate our activities politically on a larger scale. Because capitalism in the States are not just operating locally. These are global forces that require global organization to defeat. And I think I would love to talk more with the Horizon Ottawa folks, see if we could have you guys involved in some way, as well as any other local groups that are on this call, just been focusing a lot on the first of those three reasons so far of cultivating knowledge sharing and experience sharing within the broader movement. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, no, I really resonate with this question, and I think for a lot of us who not only live in the city, but live all over the place, for us, naturally, the question is that there is no other option but to look at this as a transnational movement, like all other social movements. And I say this for someone who is part of a diaspora group. I'm Ghanaian Canadian. My family is from Ghana. I've still strong connections back home, even right now with what's happening with some state-sanctioned violence against LGBTQ people, right? And so many other people in Canada and also in this city are connected to other places. And there's a lot of lessons to be learned by us and engaging in how we do transnational solidarity work that we can see from a municipalist perspective, but we're already doing that. And I think there's no surprise that we have people who are on this panel who are from different countries, are located in different countries, right? There are lessons to be learned and we don't have to reinvent the wheel. And part of what we're doing at the local level is part of something bigger. And so I really appreciate all of you sharing your different insight. So this last question is for everybody, but you might not know this, but we're preparing here in Ottawa for our own elections here. And there'll be elections at the municipal level all across Ontario in 2022. My question to all of you is, how can we work towards building a participatory I cannot say this word, municipalist platform? Would anyone like to go first?
I feel like that's a Kate question.
Kate, we're looking at you.
Okay. Definitely start a choir. Couldn't recommend it more. Music is good. I mean, I really do reiterate what I said before. Don't do anything that isn't fun, isn't useful, or doesn't create community. Anything, all of those things should be at the heart of everything you do. The other thing I would say is start by listening. We started our first summer before our first election campaign. We did a campaign called Winning by Listening. We basically took a little trestle table out into the squares of Barcelona every weekend with a microphone. We said, we want to win Barcelona. Tell us what you think about what's happening in this neighborhood. And we'd had an open mic and people would gather around. I mean, the weather's good here, that helps. But and we just listened, and actually that helped us to confirm and enrich, the diagnosis we already had about what was going on. Listening is really important. And then I think the other thing is this idea of the small victories, and that actually perfection or purity is overrated, and actually winning and getting things done is sometimes underrated. And so have a kind of pragmatic approach, and yeah, those are kind of the main ideas I'd put out there.
I can say a couple of things about this. Since we're really specifically talking electoral politics here, first of all, of course, as always, Barcelona and Comu leads the way, and everything that Kate said is wonderful. I especially love the start by listening. That's so important. To the degree that it is possible to bring people together as it gets closer to when you're really starting to campaign, I think that's helpful, because people can get to know each other and meet each other and be in a common space. But I think also, one of the things that's already started to happen in Ottawa is that you're identifying the serious issues facing the city, and being issue oriented is incredibly important. I mean, that sort of follows on what Kate was saying about finding out what's on people's minds, but also sort of identifying some of the real problems that are facing the city and that are facing the neighborhoods. And then, frankly, tightening your message. I used to work for Bernie Sanders, and one of the things that Bernie does very well is he basically repeats the same things over and over and over again. And so when you are actually at the point where you're starting to produce literature and, putting out your message, I think, it is helpful. It's always great to have a big, long platform, but it's also really helpful to have sort of bullet points. And secondarily to that, to really contrast your position from those of the existing councillors. It depends, I guess, on who's running where and on what votes have been taken. But, very often, in Burlington, for example, in 2017, when the municipal the municipalist candidate ran, you know, she said, here's where I stand on the deployment of the F-35 fighter jets, you know, and at our national, they have a National Guard on the airfield there, you know, and here's where my opponent stands. And just doing that, even in sort of in a simple one page, you know, little box sort of thing, can be actually really helpful. And then, you know, doing this sort of work of voter identification, starting to really think about, you know, how to get your kind of the people who like to do things like either going door to door or doing phone calls, you know, that kind of thing mobilized. So those are just a couple of concrete things that I think of. And again, you know, getting people together where they can engage and discuss as well and feel like they're really part of the process.
Yeah, I just want to mention here when you were talking about open mics and listening to people, and I think one important thing is to know that people doesn't feel entitled to talk. So I think it's important to remember that in order to try to seek also the voices of the ones that are not normally heard. And I think if not, at least try to think about all these people that, because normally when you find, when you try to democratize institutions, you find some people that is normally like more prepared to talk and all that. And here I like the idea in Barcelona also to talk about rights. The idea of talking about rights. We were talking about transit. We were talking about mobility. I think it's important to talk about rights, going from the right to the city, and touch about many things. And right to clean air, right to, you know, safe spaces, right to, for example, in Barcelona, the idea I like it also is the right to smile. And municipalist care, how do you say, dental care office was set. And I think it was amazing because they were saying, okay, there is people there out in the street that the state is not taking care of their dental and of their dental care, and they cannot smile directly, you know? So the right to smile, I mean, I found it is also quite beautiful in order to express all these small things that are very important to the everyday people's lives. Yeah.
Mason, did you want to try answering that question?
Yeah. So, I mean, I should preface this by saying I've never built a citizens platform to the municipal level, but and I think in a lot of ways, you know, there's no blueprint here. Most groups are making the path by walking, but I think there are a couple of main lessons that can be drawn from these experiments that are really important. And I think the main one is to not put the cart before the horse. There are no shortcuts to building real democracy, and in so many ways, the realm of representative politics is designed to thwart democratic participation and people's control over their lives. And if we are going to be able to strategically engage within that space towards the aim of transforming it into something else, I think we need to have a base of popular power, of actually existing forms and institutions of direct democracy outside it that can hold one's candidates, one's delegates to account, that can have built up the processes of community decision making that are better than how representative government functions. And I think there's lots of value to running campaigns like this for propaganda purposes, trying to inject into people's minds on a larger scale how we could do things differently. But I don't think you can jump over the much slower work of building democracy from the neighborhood level up by winning elections. And I also think that having that base of popular power outside of the city government is the absolute best foundation you can have for running successful electoral campaigns locally as well. And because you have that built-in infrastructure of community activity and decision-making, and kind of like deepening our level of politicization with working class people in our neighborhoods. And I think that has to be kept at the center of our organizing work, and you know, treat the electoral sphere as more of a space of strategic engagement rather than the project itself.
Awesome. Thank you so much for answering that question and for answering all of my questions that have been given you all today. I really appreciate it. Before I move into the Q&A section, I just wanted to, going back to the last question, remind people we do have an election at the municipal level in 2022. So if you're someone like myself who really enjoys civic engagement at the electoral level, now's the time to start thinking about what we want to see with our leadership and to find spaces like Horizon Ottawa or other little assemblies that we have across the city to start getting engaged and making sure that we have the right people reflecting the city we want at the decision-making table. So there were lots of questions coming in during the session here with the panelists. And so I want to give a shout out to our moderator who's compiled them all for me. I'm going to go ahead and start off with the questions here, and these are open to the floor, so feel free to answer them how you'd like. And I'm going to make sure that I'm keeping an eye on time because these questions are amazing, and I want to make sure we can go through as many as we can as possible. So the first question we got was from Muhammad Arif. I have a question. How do we see the context of building a municipalist, I got that right for the first time, movement and building a participatory democracy in the context of an authoritarian state and in an unstable situation such as in Myanmar, for example? Civil society in Myanmar is fighting against junta regime. So this is more about municipalism and authoritarian states. Would anyone like to tackle that one first?
I can give it a go. I think the main approach is to look to the people who have done it, because there are lots of examples through history and in the present of revolutionary democracy movements taking enormous strides under some of the most repressive circumstances imaginable. And I think one of the things we do have to keep in mind is like trying to build democracy in an authoritarian situation is a revolutionary project, and the kinds of precautions that need to be taken for any revolutionary work would apply to all aspects of community life. Some of the really powerful examples that I think should be discussed more, in addition to like the work in Rojava, is the neighborhood popular council movement that was the driving force behind the first Intifada in Palestine in the 1980s and 1990s. One of the most repressive authoritarian circumstances that has existed in decades, and what they were able to do was build a federation of popular assemblies that were not just running day-to-day life, keeping schools open, doing mutual aid to keep people fed during the struggle, but also actively leading the resistance to the military occupation. And I think that's one of the really common threads of these kinds of movements happening in authoritarian circumstances, is that they have fused the work of keeping their people alive under these circumstances with the politics of overthrow, of seeking to displace the oppressive authority itself. Some other really interesting ones that I think people should study more to try to understand what's really powerful and effective with this is in Bolivia, with the indigenous councils in El Alto, which really came into international recognition during back in 2005, when they're resisting neoliberal takeovers of their water and gas. But those same kinds of social forces and neighborhood level organization were also essential to resisting the coup that took place this past year, and the attempted reinstatement of a right-wing dictatorship in the country, being able to be cast out by that kind of mass mobilization politics that was rooted in individual neighborhoods and principles of direct democracy. And then a last one that I think is really relevant to kind of these sorts of questions is the Zapatista struggle in southern Mexico. And while this is not an authoritarian situation in a conventional sense, I mean, Mexico has an elected democratic government. The relationship of the state to these efforts at indigenous autonomy in Chiapas are certainly authoritarian. They've experienced kind of a process of military encirclement of their project, and the ways in which they have been able to maintain open democracy internally under these circumstances, I think is really interesting. It's something that we need to try to learn from and replicate, because I think the kinds of repression that these successful radical democracy movements face are exactly the kinds of ones that we will need to prepare for, if we're serious about taking this work all the way in our own context, because I think we can be pretty confident that our ruling class is not going to lie down and take it either. Yeah, and I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. I'm looking at time, and so I might just move to the next question if the panelists are okay with that. So the next question comes from Christina, and Christina asks, how can we navigate the issue of NIMBYism, so the not in my backyard sentiment that you usually get here at the city level, when we are working through local issues? For example, if a community says no to an industrial build, where does it go? Will it not have to go somewhere? So this is in relation to NIMBYism in general, but then I think we can touch on the examples that were shared here by Christina. Anyone want to tackle this question? Going once, going twice.
I don't know if in Barcelona they've had more experience with that. I mean, my only brief answer to that would be that the questions of land use are important and are complicated, and the more that we can try and create alternatives to the standard operating system right now, which is lands bought, sold, put up whatever a developer can get through with, the more that we can focus on things like community land trusts and community input about what is needed. I mean, ultimately what we really need, and again, this is much, much more complicated than we have time for. I'm going to keep myself to 1 minute in this answer, because I know there's been a lot of interesting questions. But, one of the things my dad used to write about with respect to municipalism was a kind of a minimum program and a maximal program. And, our minimum program is based on very specific concrete things that we can do, like the, municipalization of electricity, for example, or other utilities. But ultimately, what municipalists, I would hope, are also striving towards is a kind of a more, what he called a moral economy, so that the community itself can begin to make decisions about, what's really necessary for a good life in our town. And, is it necessary to have unlimited growth just for the sake of growth? I think most of us would agree that it's not. In terms of the very specific question of NIMBYism, yes, there's always going to be a case where somebody's going to want to put something somewhere and the community doesn't want it. The more input certainly that you can have from say neighborhood planning assemblies or other types of assemblies, and sort of working in the direction of sort of equitable use of land and space, the better it is. I don't know that there's any one simple answer to that, but obviously community involvement, I think, is the most important aspect.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Debbie. If I don't see anyone else want to jump in, I'm just going to move right to the next question. And this one comes from Jacob Hendren, and this is regarding linguistic tensions. How do the linguistic and political tensions that have defined Catalonia over the past decade affect political organizing in Barcelona? What lessons can we apply to a Canadian context? And boy, I believe there are a lot of lessons that we can apply here. Would love to hear from our colleagues in Spain.
Shall I start? I can't see if David's. I'll just two things.
Kate,
The first thing is that to say that the Catalan independence question divides the left, right? And so actually, in the first instance, having a city-based project is actually really useful to bring together people who disagree on national issues. And I've seen that in a lot of different countries, whether it be, in the UK with Brexit or these other kind of issues that are very, one level national or regional. And so in that sense, looking on the positive side, the local level can bring together people who at other levels disagree on big questions. But it has been really, really also difficult for us because we've been subject to constant attacks from both sides. And the national issue has dominated politics, so that makes it difficult to get our issues on the agenda. It means that also people vote, particularly not so much in 2015, but in 2019 at the last local elections, people were voting also in the city elections thinking about the national question. So, I mean, on participation, it doesn't affect us so much because Catalan and Spanish are relatively similar, and most people who live in Barcelona who understand one understand the other. So I'm not sure. It's more difficult for me to think about how it might play out in Canada, but yeah, some initial ideas.
If I can add here something, I just think that we're talking about small victories, and I think here the problem with the seek for independence is that sometimes has relied on promises that goes about creating a state in 18 months, and this doesn't help for political the long-term construction of political alternatives, and this dynamites the patience that sometimes political change needs. And I think that this has created a lot of frustration of people and needs a scapegoat. So even in Barcelona and Comu, we want a referendum. We want like people to vote. We want to support, movements that seek the participation of people. Sometimes we find a lot of violence to our movement just because of trying to talk about dialogue and try to talk about, these small victories, So I think that's an important thing to take into account.
Absolutely. And just to provide maybe a little bit of context for the Canadian situation. So Canada has two official languages, English and French. And I think those two tend to dominate conversations between conflict, especially in the context of referendums in the past with our province of Quebec, which is an predominantly French province. But this is all happening on top of the colonial legacy of the fact that Indigenous languages are not considered official and have been stripped away from many of our Indigenous siblings across Canada as they're fighting for one, for their languages to survive, but then also self-determination. And so I believe there are definitely some lessons there, but I think it's hyper complicated in the Canadian context when you look at it from both the state level, but then also from a decolonial lens for sure. So we appreciate the insights you've shared with us. So the next question is from Tyler Pajic. Hi, Tyler. With respect to the question, why municipalism and why not these other things? One of those other things might be electoral politics at the provincial or federal level. What do you see as the relationship between a municipalist movement or organization and electoral or party politics at the provincial or federal level? Specifically, if some things that we are trying to achieve at the municipal level can be achieved easier with a change in legislation or regulation, or especially funding at the provincial or federal level, ought we to also be engaging with politics at those levels too? What might that look like? Any examples to share? And this is open to anyone.
I would love to answer this one because it's actually one of the issues that has created the most debate in Barcelona and Comu. And we have actually ultimately participated in the elections to the Spanish Parliament and also to the Catalan Parliament. And there are some people who think that was a mistake. There are some people who think it's absolutely necessary for the reasons suggested by the question, right? Which is that a lot of housing laws, for example, are made at those levels. But I think the thing that, whether strategically it makes sense or not, I think there's something that we have to really understand, which is it's not possible to do the same kind of democratic politics at a larger scale. Or if it is, I haven't seen it happen. And in fact, it's very difficult to do it on the scale of a large city. It's very difficult to do it at the scale of a neighborhood. It's very difficult to do in general. But until we've managed to do it at local level, we're not going to be able to do it at a bigger scale. And what does that mean? That means that even if you strategically might decide that it makes sense to either support candidates or stand candidates at other levels, those levels will never have the same transformative power as municipal politics does, because they're never going to have people getting together and building collective power. And as Debbie said before, in that process, changing themselves and who they are and what they know and how they understand the world. So yeah, it's a big debate in municipalism, and not one that's been resolved, I would say.
Thank you. So I'm looking at the time, and we do have a long list. And so I'm going to ask two more questions. One that is related to transportation in rural areas, because I feel like we really need to dig into that. And then one conclusion question. But I just wanted to say for the folks at Horizon, this list that's been compiled, definitely it might be something for us to reference in the future, whether it's reaching out back to our colleagues, or maybe events that might be focused on certain questions that have been asked here. And so wink, wink, nudge, nudge to you folks on the organizing team. But the next question I wanted to ask our panelists, and this is from J.K. Harris. While I understand we are speaking about Ottawa in this context, I would love to hear concepts about how to address safe transportation in rural areas where there is no city transportation at all. And I thought it would be really great to hear from you all, or from maybe Mason, to give you an opportunity to tackle that question with the work that you've been doing in Detroit and possibly maybe rural areas in Michigan.
Well, I've done no transit organizing with rural parts of the state, but I think those are precisely the kinds of things that it makes sense to have radicals trying to have an expansive view of the public sphere, getting engaged in really local politics, because things like transportation spending are township by township, county by county, like very small low levels of government that are for the most part in charge of them and setting them up in the first place. And there's lots of models worldwide of how public transit can work effectively in lower density areas. I don't think being outside of a dense city makes safe and effective public transit non-starter at all. But there needs to be the political will to put public funds behind it, and those are some of the I think really important strategic fights that can be had within local government in rural, exurban areas, and around which you can build broader campaigns and build organizations of people who are willing to fight for that.
Thank you, Mason. So the last question for our panelists that is coming from our attendees. This is a two-parter, and this is coming from Patty Murphy, so thank you for your question. For those of us who are new to this movement, what do we do first? For people who are already in, what's your next move or highest priority? Examples would be great. And then the second part to that question, and this is directly to Kate and David, I find the empowering of municipal care workers so exciting. How did this seemingly impossible idea, to borrow from my question, get out of people's heads and into action?
I guess I can take a shot at the first one if no one
Absolutely.
else is jumping at it. I think in almost all contexts, if you are just getting started, the first thing to do is to meet your neighbors. You've got to know the people that you are trying to build community with. You need to establish relationships. Relationships are the precondition for collective action, for building institutions that include all of us. And I imagine Canada is for the most part very similar to the United States in this regard, in that we largely have very atomized social lives. There's very little inbuilt community in day-to-day life for most of us. And if we are going to build a politics of community, we need to start by building community itself. And I think that can lead into, in very straightforward and organic ways, the kinds of movement building work that are centered around growing community power and direct democracy in our neighborhoods. And so the kinds of conversations that we have going into meeting other people in organizing context, need to kind of be moving beyond the small talk stuff and trying to identify common problems, things that we share that are things that we want to overcome and that we could overcome if we work together. And I think that's the foundation of all movement work, and being able to enter into that from the standpoint of being a neighbor or a fellow tenant is such a resource. It's hard in lots of contexts to be able to have that first conversation with someone that you don't know, to try to build something together. And the fact that we live in such close proximity to someone is something to build on for that. It's a way into these kinds of really crucial conversations that lots of other contexts don't have, and we should make the most of it. As for what I'm looking to do next, we're kind of at the stage where we're trying to deepen our relationships with other community organizations in the wider neighborhood, towards kicking off a more established coalitional structure between these different block clubs. And then another project that I'm involved in that's trying to take this to a higher level within the city. It's called Detroit Build and Fight, which is more of a cadre organization that kind of has an explicit revolutionary politics. And what we're trying to do is create a space for neighborhood organizers to get the skills to build these kinds of, do this kind of base building work neighborhood by neighborhood, and facilitate linking these together into a real dual power within the city of Detroit. And so all of that is just building on those kind of like baseline face-to-face conversations with people as neighbors, but trying to channel that into a politics at a higher scale.
I'd like to follow up on something that Mason said, and since this is sort of the conclusory part of our, just tie together a couple of things, including maybe a couple of questions that came up. I started out talking about how, municipalism obviously has to be different things in different places. But I also feel, and that, for example, given what you're facing in Ottawa and what, for example, Burlington was facing, Burlington, Vermont in 1980, when Bernie Sanders was first elected, he became mayor in 1981, where, his primary slogan was "the city is not for sale." And it was sort of the sense of urgency. And it sounds like I'm feeling that from what folks are sort of saying about what's been going on and what I've read, thanks to Sam, about Ottawa. But having said that, I really want to kind of reiterate what Mason said a little bit earlier, which is that I still think that ultimately a municipalist politics has to be at sort of ultimately at its most effective, ultimately about divesting the state of power. And so going back to Tyler's question, about what do we do about national and regional politics, which Kate, made some really great points about their experience in Barcelona. I know this is a really difficult question because, often regional governments stop cities from taking action. A city will say, okay, we're going to ban fracking within our borders. And the state goes, no, you're not, in the United States. So I'm certainly not against the idea of electing, representatives. I mean, I voted in the, in the Democratic primary and in the American general election. Obviously, we had to stop Trump, even if Biden's not exactly my idea of a radical candidate. But so, the question is sort of where you're going to put most of your energy. And I think that, it's funny to me, people, and again, I'm going to mention the fact that I had mentioned earlier Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders is a very progressive candidate. He's not at all a municipalist. And the city of Burlington right now is not a whole lot better off than it was 40 years ago when he first threw out the Democratic mayor. And the reason for that is that while there have been some progressives elected to city council in Burlington, a lot of them are quite unresponsive to the neighborhoods, even the progressives. And so municipalism is not just about electing progressive candidates. It cannot be. It really has to be about changing the nature of politics. It really has to be about empowering people on the local level, because what we see over and over again is that people, even with the best intentions, get co-opted. And I saw this, I witnessed this, firsthand living in Germany in 1984 and 85 with the German Green Party. It was then called the West German Green Party. And, people went in there saying we're an anti-party party and all this stuff. But, then they were 10 years later forming coalitions, with the CDU. The conservative, the Christian Democratic Party. So I just, I hope that if people will take away one thing from this conversation, it is that as important as it is to contest these bad people in city council in Ottawa, it's really about building a grassroots movement. It's really about building a dual power. It's really about trying to divest the state of its power, because it's the state that props up the corporations. It's the state that continuously tries to disinvest people of power. And so, while yes, it may be, you may decide at some point we are going to try and elect somebody regionally, I would just say, I would hope that you would make sure that that candidate is really responsive to the bylaws that you've put together as a community, as a city, and that you've worked to help other perhaps nearby cities do, the bylaws, the code of ethics, the ideas of full transparency, accountability, ethics, because otherwise you risk becoming just another party, even though I know parties are outlawed, but that kind of politics, that sort of party politics. And so that's sort of the last thought that I just would want to leave folks with, which is, as Mason said, this kind of going around meeting neighbors, which it's funny, people were ready to do by the hundreds to elect Bernie Sanders as president. People went knocking door to door. And yet when you say, let's go door to door and talk about creating a local assembly, people go, oh, I don't know, should we do that? So that's kind of what I would say, is just to address that part of that question and the previous one, is to really try as hard as possible not to put the cart before the horse, to try and really think about what a new politics could be for Ottawa, and then find a local issue, a really concrete local issue, and start right there. Thanks.
Thanks, Debbie and Mason, for tackling the first part of that question. And before we conclude, I wanted to give Kate and David the opportunity to answer the second part of the question, which tied on municipal care workers and how did the seemingly impossible idea get out of people's heads and into action. So if you wanted to touch on that, that'd be great.
Yeah, it actually connects with Debbie's point, because in Barcelona, we arrived in the government saying we want to remunicipalize the care, the municipal care work. But the state put a limit on budget spending and put some limits on doing that. The state is putting limits to remunicipalizations, okay? Because big companies also want these contracts. So I think the important thing of municipal is to bring ideas. When you have a barrier, you bring a new idea. So the idea was to okay, in care workers work in a very atomistic way, this bureaucracy, and then you have this care worker that has to do all alone by a coordinator that says, okay, you go to this home, and you do this, and that's it, and you go home to your home. So in the municipality, they say, we're gonna put care workers into teams of 10 people, and they're gonna have this area, and they're gonna organize their work. They're gonna organize their timing, and they're gonna, organize their schedules. And this was a small step, but it's going to be it's the first step in order to try to make care a community responsibility as well, because we're trying to activate the community into care, and to start making. And imagine a big company, a multinational, the state. Why would they want to put workers together? Amazon trying to put workers together to talk and to organize and all that. So a municipal strategy has to try to to make people self-organize and try to work together. No, so I think that is an important step.
So, Kate, I'm not sure if you wanted to add to that at all. Okay, perfect. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for being able to answer those questions from the Q&A. Before we jump into the conclusion, I wanted to give Sam the opportunity to share some things from Horizon with regards to fundraising.
Thank you, Debbie. Appreciate that. Well, first, premièrement, je voulais encore remercier notre excellente modératrice, Debbie Owusu-Akyeeah, et nos merveilleuses panélistes, Debbie Bookchin, David Palomera, Kate Shea, Baird et Mason Herson-Hord. Le but de l'événement aujourd'hui était d'inspirer les gens autour de notre ville, mais aussi autour du monde et notre pays. Et je pense qu'on a réussi. And, also, I just want to touch on an important point before I go into that, is that a lot of folks have brought up in the chat, at least, that, we have to, municipalism is, about electing progressive city councilors, but also, bridging social movements together. Electoral politics, not often the most important form of political participation, though an important one. And also, before I go into that, I saw this behind Debbie, but I would like to encourage folks to buy a copy of Fearless Cities, which is a great, wonderful book for folks who want to get an introduction to municipalism. And folks, we heard a lot today about reimagining our cities and what can happen if we let the powers that be take hold of the imagination of Ottawa residents. Our city is at a crossroads. On Wednesday, our city council is talking about massively cutting transit routes without any resident consultation. Police continue to be heavily funded despite the harm they continue to cause to BIPOC communities. And our mayor and majority of city council continue to actively fight against the material interests of poor, working class, and racialized people across our city. Folks, we're not going to skirt around it. If we wish to challenge wealthy corporate developers and fight for the issues that matter at City Hall, like folks have been doing in Barcelona, if we want to build a movement, host events like these ones, have folks organizing for change across our city to change politics, like folks have been speaking about so eloquently today, we're going to have to obtain the resources we need to do it. So if you can spare it, we would greatly appreciate what you can give to build an Ottawa that genuinely works for everyone. HorizonOttawa.ca/donate is how you can donate, so we can put on more events like this one and have a movement across the city. And I think Danica, who's been helping moderate this chat today, has put that in our chat. And also, I want to say, although money is very important, it's obviously not the only resource. We obviously also need people to build a people-powered movement. So if you're interested and you live in Ottawa or in the Ottawa-Gatineau area, we invite you to join us, and be part of this movement to change the way we think about the city. Because as I alluded to earlier, if we don't capture the imagination of residents across the city of Ottawa, we know that other folks will. So, and I think Danica posted the membership link as well. So again, I would encourage folks to donate today to Horizon Ottawa, as well as become a member, and also check out all the great work by Barcelona and Comu and Debbie Bookchin, and also follow Debbie, Kate, David, and Mason, and Debbie Owusu-Akyeeah, our moderator, all on Twitter, and Horizon Ottawa, obviously. So I'll turn it back to you, Debbie. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sam. And before I say goodbye to all of you, once again, thank you to each and every one of our panelists, Kate, David, Debbie, and Mason. Thank you so much for sharing your insight and hearing me mispronounce words, but which I do often, but that's okay. You stuck it with me and I really appreciate it. And I also want to thank those who were in attendance. We had over 100 people at the max, which is amazing and really exciting to see. And Horizon Ottawa, thank you for bringing us all together. I did not imagine my Sunday to be like this until I saw the event first become on internet promote. And so I really appreciate you bringing us all together. And I'm actually gonna take a quote from Clark, who was in the comments, which I think is a beautiful summary of the conversation we had. To take power, we have to be the power. Politicians must be our delegates, not our representatives. And I think that's a beautiful quote that beautifully summarizes this entire conversation. And not only that, and I've been mentioning this all the time, building community is part of making a people-powered movement. And like, they have to happen at the same time together. You have to know who your neighbors are. You have to have fun. And we have to find those issues that we think are important, but also winnable, to keep engaging people so that that imagined future we want for our city can be a reality. And so thank you so much again for everyone being here. I've learned so much from my colleagues here on the panel, and so much from even a lot of you through the comments and the questions that you've had. I'm hoping that this is only another beginning, since we've been doing this for a while, but it's another beginning for us. And I cannot wait to see what happens from our organizing going forward. Thank you, everyone.